Leah froze at the edge of the alley, her father's blood still pooling on the cracked pavement behind her. Her life had fractured in a single moment, stripped of the only person who had ever anchored her. She didn't scream, didn't cry, and she didn't run. She just stood, stunned and unprotected, as if the weight of the world had finally descended and left her exposed. And then she felt him, Raymond, standing a few steps away, tall, composed, and impossibly aware. Raymond's eyes scanned her quickly, noting every detail: the tremor in her hands, the damp strands of hair clinging to her face, the way she refused to collapse entirely. He did not speak. He did not ask questions. He simply stepped closer, silent, assessing the scene with the precision of a man who had spent his life learning how to control chaos. The man lying on the ground, her father, had served Raymond's father loyally for years, quietly handling tasks that kept the family's business running smoothly. And now he was gone, leaving Leah exposed in a world that did not forgive weakness. In that instant, Raymond made a decision that would shape both their lives. She would survive. She would not face the world alone. Hi family, do you know getting a script and images, even having to work on voiceovers can be so draining? And that's why I need you to subscribe to my channel to give me the push I need to keep going. It's sincerely not easy, but I am sure your subscription and watch will help me keep going. Thank you so much. Let us continue. From that night onward, Leah became the one promise he could never break. Raymond was not sentimental, and he did not act out of kindness. His world had taught him early that attachments were liabilities, that emotions made people soft, vulnerable, and weak. Yet there was something about Leah, something small but unyielding in the way she stood, that made him pause. She did not need a savior, but she would have one anyway. And he would be that savior whether she knew it or not. In the days and weeks that followed, Raymond ensured Leah's survival without ever intruding on her life. He arranged a modest apartment for her, quietly covered the rent, and ensured her father's final debts were cleared. He paid for groceries and school fees through channels she would never trace back to him. Men he trusted watched over the area, invisible and silent, making sure no threat reached her. Leah noticed the stability, the small conveniences, but she never knew the source. To her, the world had simply softened around her, granting her a chance to rebuild. Raymond watched from a distance, satisfied with the quiet execution of his promise. Leah went about her life with a careful resilience, taking small jobs, enrolling in classes, and slowly reclaiming pieces of herself that the tragedy had tried to erase. She did not know the full extent of his vigilance. She did not know how often he traced her movements, how often he stayed awake nights planning contingencies for threats she could not see. In his mind, every decision was calculated. Every protection, every intervention, every precaution ensured her survival without ever infringing on her freedom. For Leah, these years were a gradual reclaiming of independence. She worked at local clinics, learned the routines of a world she could control, and built a sense of normalcy out of a life that had been violently disrupted. Raymond's influence was invisible but constant, like gravity, a force shaping her life without her realizing it. He did not involve her in his world, the world of power and calculation, of influence and fear. He kept her separate from it, even as it had shaped him into the man standing quietly at the edge of her life. And yet, the promise he had made that night remained. It was unspoken, unacknowledged, but never broken. Raymond had become a man defined by rules, by strategy, by a life of observing and manipulating outcomes. But in Leah, he had found a responsibility that was not negotiable. She became the axis on which some of his decisions turned, even when he pretended otherwise. Every time he ensured her safety, every time he observed her thriving quietly in a world she had rebuilt, he reminded himself that this was not affection, not attachment, it was duty. Yet duty often walked the same line as obsession, and he would come to realize that some promises could change the heart without warning. By the time Leah reached adulthood, she had become strong in ways Raymond had anticipated and in ways he had not. She had resilience, independence, and an instinct for survival that mirrored his own. She carried herself through life quietly, working and saving, unaware of the force that had been shaping her life for years. Raymond continued to watch, continued to protect, without interference, maintaining the careful balance between safety and freedom. And as he observed her from the edges of his world, he understood something he could never speak aloud. The girl he had sworn to protect had become more than a responsibility, she had become the center of a promise that had quietly, irreversibly bound their lives together. Leah's life had begun to settle into quiet routines. Her apartment, modest and functional, became a sanctuary where she could reclaim the pieces of normalcy her father's death had scattered. She worked at the local community clinic, Her days filled with patients who were unaware of the storm that had once shaped her life. Her independence, fragile at first, had become a steady rhythm, a deliberate assertion that the tragedy she had endured would not define her entirely. But Raymond remained in the shadows, watching, calculating, guarding, and quietly shaping the space around her. Raymond had grown into a man whose presence commanded attention without effort. He moved through the city with the same precision he had always possessed, the streets and buildings bending around him like a familiar map. His influence extended into corners of the city Leah would never see or imagine, yet it always reached her. It was subtle, an unpaid bill quietly settled, a neighbor who spoke favorably when she needed it, a small obstacle removed from her path without her knowledge. He did not intrude, but the pull of his control was invisible and constant, a force Leah neither understood nor could resist. She began to notice it, though not immediately. The small conveniences, the ease with which doors opened or problems resolved, started to feel almost unnatural. At first she brushed it off, attributing it to luck or the kindness of strangers. But as months passed, it became undeniable. Things in her life rarely went wrong, and when they did, someone somewhere intervened without her awareness. She began to feel the presence of a force larger than herself, a weight both reassuring and suffocating. Raymond, for his part, struggled with the shift in his perception of her. She was no longer the fragile girl he had rescued that night on the rain-soaked street. She had grown stronger, smarter, and increasingly stubborn. Every act of independence she claimed, every choice she made without consulting anyone, chipped away at the carefully maintained boundaries he had established. He realized, with a mixture of admiration and unease, that he could not control her the way he had intended. The protective distance he thought necessary was slipping, and with it came an unfamiliar tension he had never experienced before. Leah began to test the edges of her autonomy. She made decisions quickly, sometimes without thinking through the consequences, driven by a desire to prove to herself that she could survive entirely on her own. She took longer walks through unfamiliar streets, lingered later at work, and started exploring parts of the city she had avoided for years. Each act of self-determination thrilled her and terrified Raymond in equal measure. He understood the risks of the world she now moved through freely. The city was not kind, and danger often hid behind ordinary faces. Yet he could not stop her, no matter how much he wanted to. This struggle between freedom and control became the unspoken rhythm of their lives. Raymond maintained his vigilance, never letting her see the full extent of his interventions. Leah, unaware of the unseen hand guiding her path, continued to navigate her independence with quiet confidence. Yet beneath her calm exterior, subtle signs of tension began to appear. She sensed she was never truly alone, that someone was always watching, always anticipating her next move. The feeling was unnerving, but it also gave her a strange sense of security. She did not know who it was, and she did not question it, not yet. Raymond, observing from his distance, began to feel something he had not anticipated. Her strength, her defiance, her growing independence, all of it awakened a sense of vulnerability within him that went beyond physical protection. He had promised to keep her safe, but he had not anticipated the emotional weight of watching her grow into a woman he could not fully shield, a woman whose life was increasingly beyond his control. He realized that protection alone was no longer sufficient. He had to navigate the tension between keeping her safe and allowing her the freedom she demanded. Leah, unknowingly, had become the measure against which Raymond judged every decision, every movement. He could no longer act solely as a guardian. She challenged him in ways that forced him to consider her as an autonomous force, not just someone to be preserved. And while he felt the pull to assert control, he also recognized the danger in doing so, the risk of pushing her away, the risk of breaking the very bond he had vowed to protect. Their lives, once defined by his vigilance and her quiet recovery, were beginning to shift. The balance of power was no longer entirely his. Leah was carving her own path, and Raymond, for the first time, realized that his control had limits. He could watch, he could guide, he could protect, but he could not dictate. And in that realization lay a tension neither of them yet fully understood, the first whisper of a struggle that would define the coming years, a struggle between freedom and guardianship, between independence and the unspoken bond that tied them together. Life had begun to test the boundaries Raymond had carefully constructed. Leah was no longer a girl to be quietly observed from the edges of her world. Her independence, once a reassuring rhythm for both of them, now carried hints of rebellion. She had grown accustomed to moving through the city on her own, making decisions without pause, and stepping into spaces that made him uneasy. Raymond had anticipated her strength, but not the subtle ways she began to challenge the protective bubble he had built around her. She took new opportunities, small at first, volunteering for longer shifts at the clinic, taking on responsibilities that pushed her schedule into the evenings, and even attending community programs he had carefully screened before. Each choice, seemingly innocent, chipped away at the quiet control he had maintained over her life. Raymond observed, unseen, analyzing patterns, calculating risks, and anticipating consequences. He realized that she was slowly slipping from the careful path he had mapped, creating possibilities he could neither predict nor fully prevent. The subtlety of Leah's drift was its own kind of tension. She did not confront him, did not rebel openly, and certainly did not acknowledge the invisible chains that bound her existence to his watch. Yet every decision she made beyond the boundaries he had set introduced a new layer of unpredictability. The small freedoms she claimed, walking unfamiliar streets, taking bus routes he hadn't monitored, even speaking to people whose backgrounds he had not vetted, made him aware of the fragile nature of his control. He felt the weight of responsibility more acutely than ever, understanding that the moment she truly stepped beyond his reach, the world could take her in ways he could never forgive himself. Leah, in her quiet determination, did not realize she was challenging a force far stronger than herself. She felt the thrill of autonomy, the satisfaction of testing her limits, unaware that every step she took beyond her known world was watched, analyzed, and accounted for. The independence she pursued was intoxicating, a proof of her survival and growth, but it also set the stage for tension neither she nor Raymond could yet fully comprehend. Her life, once a carefully measured routine, was evolving into something dynamic, something that could no longer be contained within the protective structures he had constructed. Raymond, meanwhile, found his sense of control slipping in ways that unsettled him deeply. He had always believed that protection was a matter of logistics, vigilance, and intervention when necessary. Yet Leah's assertiveness, her quiet defiance, and her willingness to step into unknown spaces challenged not only his control but also the emotional equilibrium he had maintained for years. He recognized the paradox. The very independence that made her strong also made her vulnerable, and the more she claimed her freedom, the more his instinct to intervene intensified. The tension between them was silent, invisible, yet undeniable. It manifested in his distant observations, in the careful calibrations of his world, in the decisions he made before she even realized they mattered. And though Leah moved forward with increasing confidence, she was beginning to sense the invisible force that shadowed her every move. It was not fear exactly, nor was it comfort. It was a strange awareness that someone, somewhere, always knew, always calculated, always ensured that she remained unharmed. This invisible struggle, between Raymond's unwavering vigilance and Leah's growing autonomy, began to define the rhythm of their lives. She was slipping from the confines he had imposed, yet he could not allow her to leave entirely. His promise, made on that rain-soaked night years ago, required him to protect her, but protecting her in the face of her independence demanded subtlety, restraint, and the constant tension of anticipation. Every choice, every movement, every unseen intervention became a careful negotiation between freedom and guardianship. By the end of this phase of their lives, Leah had grown into a woman who was difficult to predict, impossible to control, and fiercely independent, yet still bound in ways she could not name to the silent presence of Raymond. And Raymond, for all his power, influence, and experience, realized that some aspects of life were no longer manageable. Leah was slipping away not in body, but in the certainty he had always felt, and the realization unsettled him profoundly. He had promised to protect her, but now he had to navigate the delicate, dangerous terrain of letting her exist as her own person, all while ensuring that the world would not destroy her in the process. Raymond had kept promises before. Dozens, hundreds, each tied to obligations, loyalties, and careful calculations. He had never broken one. But Leah, the girl who had grown from the rain-soaked alley into a woman who walked through the city with quiet authority, had begun to test the limits of every vow he had ever made. The promise he had whispered to himself that night, the promise to keep her safe, had always been simple in concept. Protect her, shield her, ensure she survived. Yet in practice, it had become a weight that pressed against his chest with increasing intensity, bending and straining him in ways he had never anticipated. She was moving through life with a confidence that both inspired and terrified him. Every step she took, every choice she made without consulting him, reminded Raymond of the fragility hidden behind her strength. He had believed that controlling the edges of her world would be enough, that his invisible hand could keep her safe without her noticing. But independence was proving to be a force of its own, pushing against his interventions, eroding the certainty he had clung to for years. For the first time, Raymond realized that some aspects of protection were beyond him, that keeping her alive was no longer simply a matter of preventing physical harm. Leah began making decisions that unnerved him profoundly. Small at first, visiting places he had not sanctioned, speaking to people whose motives he could not verify, and testing limits he had never imagined she would approach. Each act chipped away at his carefully constructed safety net, and with it came a growing, gnawing fear. It was a fear he had never allowed himself before, because he had never encountered a situation where the rules were insufficient. Leah's life was no longer governed by boundaries he could manage, it was governed by her own choices, and those choices could carry her into danger he could not control. The weight of the promise he had made that night, the one simple, unspoken vow to protect her, began to break him from within. It was not just the challenge of her independence that threatened him. It was the realization that he was not only responsible for her survival, but also for her life as a whole. Her mistakes, her risks, her moments of reckless courage. Each one became a test, a silent question of whether he could truly honor the vow he had made, or whether his obsession with control would crumble under the reality of her freedom. And yet he could not stop himself. Raymond's world was one of calculation, but even he could not calculate the pull he felt toward her. A pull that was no longer merely protective, no longer simply about duty. He was bound to her in a way that had nothing to do with obligation. Every glance he stole, every thought he had about her safety, carried a weight that threatened to fracture his self-discipline. The promise had always been simple: keep her alive. But the moment she became a woman with her own will, that promise became infinitely more complex. To honor it now required not just vigilance, but emotional endurance, restraint, and a careful navigation of the space between guardianship and influence. Leah, unaware of the magnitude of the forces shaping her life, continued to move forward with quiet determination. She felt the edges of freedom brushing against the unseen walls of protection Raymond had erected, sensing a presence she could not name. That awareness, subtle and instinctive, created a tension she did not understand, a feeling of safety paired with restraint, security paired with silent limits. She moved forward, testing boundaries, unaware that each step was being watched, measured, and accounted for in a ledger Raymond kept in his mind alone. The promise that had once been a straightforward vow, protect her, keep her safe, was now a living, breathing force, pressing against him from every direction. It shaped his choices, dictated his movements, and haunted his quiet moments. It forced him to reconcile two conflicting truths: Leah's right to independence and his own compulsion to control the world around her. Raymond had built an empire of influence, a network of power designed to manipulate outcomes and prevent chaos, yet he realized that some chaos was beyond even him, and it revolved entirely around the girl he had vowed to protect. By the end of this stage, Raymond understood the gravity of his situation. The promise he had made so casually that night on the rain-soaked street had become a chain that bound him not only to Leah's safety but to the delicate, intricate, and dangerous balance of her life. Every choice he made was now measured against the consequences for her. Every risk, every calculation, every unseen intervention carried a weight he had never experienced before. The vow that had once been simple, clear, and resolute had evolved into something heavier, something that would define him, haunt him, and ultimately break him in ways he could not yet foresee. Raymond had always believed he was untouchable to the usual forces that moved through men: fear, desire, attachment. His life had been a ledger of control, each decision calculated, each bond measured and minimized. He felt little for most people, owed nothing, gave nothing, and yet carried the weight of expectations like armor. But Leah had changed the equation entirely. She had grown into a woman whose mere presence in a room could disturb the balance he had spent decades perfecting, and now, for reasons he could neither name nor admit, he felt a surge that was entirely foreign: jealousy. It began quietly. A subtle twist in his chest when he noticed a glance from someone lingering on her, a flicker of attention that belonged to another man. At first he tried to dismiss it as irrelevant, irrational even. After all, his bond with Leah was not built on affection or desire, but on duty and promise. Yet the sensation refused to fade. Every time she smiled at someone, laughed at a comment he did not hear, or lingered just slightly longer in the presence of another, a cold, unfamiliar fire burned behind his calm exterior. He did not understand it, could not name it, and the awareness of it terrified him. Leah, oblivious to the stirrings inside Raymond, continued her life with the same independence that had both awed and unnerved him in previous months. She spoke to co-workers, made new acquaintances, and moved through the city with an ease that suggested she was reclaiming a freedom he had spent years meticulously guarding. To anyone else it was ordinary. To Raymond, it was an intrusion into a world he had believed belonged to him alone, a subtle violation of the promise he had never vocalized but which governed his every thought. The jealousy was not loud or rash, it was a quiet, simmering presence, like an undercurrent beneath calm waters. He did not confront it, could not act upon it overtly, but it affected him in ways he had never experienced. Every decision he made, every move he orchestrated, was now measured not just by risk, but by the possibility of others claiming her attention, drawing her interest away from the invisible tether that bound her to him. It was as though her mere proximity to another person threatened the control he had never acknowledged he sought. Even in the solitude of his office, where deals and power moves dominated his life, the thought of her with someone else intruded. It was irrational. She was hers to live as she chose, and yet the idea of another man entering her orbit created a tension he could not dispel. He tried to bury it beneath logic, beneath reason, beneath the careful calculations of a life built on control, but it persisted. It was not affection, not desire, not possession exactly, it was something older, deeper, and far more dangerous. An instinct to claim what he had sworn to protect, to ensure it remained untouchable by the world, by anyone else. Raymond's observations became more intense. He noticed details he had never paid attention to, the slight tilt of her head when she laughed, the way she carried herself when someone else's gaze lingered too long, the small gestures that were uniquely hers. And with each observation the fire of jealousy flared more sharply. It was a sensation he had dismissed in other men, an emotion he had never believed could define a person. But now it defined him. Leah's freedom, which he had long fought to preserve, was the very thing igniting an unfamiliar, urgent protectiveness that carried the sharp edge of possessiveness. Leah, unaware of the storm gathering in the man who had silently governed her world for years, continued to move forward with her independence intact. She smiled at life, challenged herself, and unknowingly fueled the very emotions Raymond struggled to contain. He watched her grow, succeed, and navigate challenges without realizing he was both guardian and prisoner to a feeling that had no place in the meticulous, controlled life he had constructed. By the end of this stage, Raymond recognized the truth he could not escape. He was jealous, a man who had never felt such a thing before, consumed in silence by a possessiveness that both terrified and fascinated him. And the irony was clear. This emotion had not come from betrayal, conflict, or desire for gain, but from the one person whose life he had vowed to protect without interference. Leah's independence, her vitality, her very existence in a world he could not fully govern had awakened something within him that defied reason, threatened his control, and would ultimately shape the choices he would make in the years to come. Raymond had always believed that the world could be measured, predicted, and controlled. Every variable accounted for, every possibility calculated, every threat neutralized before it even reached the edge of his awareness. Leah had been one such variable, fragile once, manageable, someone whose life he could shape from the shadows, guiding her every move without her knowledge. But the delicate equilibrium he had built over years was beginning to fracture. The unraveling had begun, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but relentless in its inevitability. It started in the quiet moments he could not ignore, the way Leah hesitated before making certain decisions, the way she looked at the world as if weighing unknown forces, as if sensing danger he had not placed there. She had always been independent, strong, determined, but now there was a recklessness in her confidence, a curiosity that drew her toward situations beyond the safety nets Raymond had so carefully woven. Every act of self-assertion, every step she took outside his invisible sphere, was a thread pulled from the tapestry of control he had long believed unbreakable. The first undeniable signs were small, almost harmless. A miscalculated decision at work, a late-night errand she insisted on completing herself, a conversation with someone he could not verify. Each incident was minor, but together they formed a pattern he could not ignore. Leah was stepping into spaces he had never sanctioned, making choices that defied the invisible boundaries he had established to keep her safe. And the realization hit him with quiet, suffocating force. His influence, his control, was slipping. Raymond watched from the shadows, his mind calculating contingencies with a precision born of years of experience, yet a new element had entered the equation: uncertainty. Leah's independence was no longer merely a challenge to his methods. It was a direct test of the bond he had sworn to protect. Each moment she moved beyond his reach was a small victory for her autonomy, but a blow to his carefully orchestrated world. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that protection was no longer enough. Safety alone could not contain the complexities of a woman who refused to be governed, who refused to exist entirely within his parameters. The unraveling extended beyond her actions to the invisible ties between them. Raymond's emotions, long restrained, began to surface in ways he could neither control nor rationalize. His jealousy, once a quiet ember, now flared with intensity whenever her independence collided with another presence, another influence, another world he could not manage. The very vow he had made to protect her now carried a paradoxical weight. To keep her safe, he must allow her freedom. Yet every step she took toward autonomy threatened to undo the promise he had made, exposing her to dangers he could neither anticipate nor prevent. Leah, for her part, remained unaware of the tension silently shaping her life. She moved forward with the quiet determination that had always defined her, yet she sensed subtle shifts in the air, the way people watched her, the careful interventions she could not name, the inexplicable ways obstacles seemed to dissipate before reaching her. It was a world she did not fully understand, but she felt its presence, and it unsettled her. The unraveling was as much about the invisible cracks in the structure surrounding her as it was about the tangible choices she now made. Raymond's struggle became increasingly personal. The promise that had once seemed straightforward, protect her, keep her safe, now demanded navigation through emotional, moral, and strategic complexities he had never anticipated. He could no longer operate from a position of simple authority. Leah's will, her intelligence, and her relentless pursuit of independence required him to reconcile his instinct to control with the reality that she would never submit entirely. The unraveling was not just her story, it was his. It forced him to confront vulnerabilities he had never acknowledged, weaknesses he had never allowed himself to feel, and desires he had long denied. By the end of this stage, the consequences of the unraveling were clear. Leah was no longer the girl he had rescued, the girl whose life he had quietly guided. She was becoming something uncontainable, a force that both inspired and unsettled him. And Raymond, for all his power and influence, realized that the promise he had made was no longer a simple vow of protection. It was a delicate balance between guardianship and freedom, between duty and the unspoken pull that tied them together. The unraveling had begun, and neither of them could escape its consequences. The city had always been a chessboard for Raymond, every move calculated, every player measured, every threat neutralized before it even appeared. But this one was different. This one could not be predicted, calculated, or controlled. He felt it the moment he noticed the subtle changes, the way shadows lingered longer around Leah, the whispered conversations she could not see, the eyes that followed her with a curiosity that bordered on malice. The threat was external, visible to no one but him, but its gravity pressed against his chest with a weight he could not ignore. Leah moved through her life with the same quiet independence that had both inspired and infuriated him. She was thriving, resilient, and increasingly daring, and yet every step she took now carried a risk that no careful planning could mitigate. Raymond's senses, honed over decades, detected the faintest tremor of danger in her environment. A passerby's glance lasted a fraction too long. A business associate lingered with too much interest in her routine. Even her casual smiles carried the potential to attract attention he could not allow. He had faced threats before, rivals, enemies, betrayal, but this one was personal. It aimed not at him, not at power, not at wealth, but at the one person he had sworn to protect above all else. The intensity of his vigilance grew. He no longer observed from a distance. He moved closer, ensuring Leah's path intersected with safety at every turn, whether she noticed or not. Men he trusted quietly scanned her surroundings, monitoring streets and buildings, watching faces in cafes, in transit, anywhere she might pass. No one could enter her space unnoticed. No one could act without his knowledge. The threat was unseen, yet it shaped every decision he made, every route she took, every hour of her life. Raymond had always prided himself on control, on predicting outcomes, on manipulating environments to ensure his objectives were never compromised. But the nature of this threat defied the systems he had built. It was subtle, insidious, almost imperceptible. It was not an enemy who confronted him openly, but a presence that hovered, a shadow that could strike without warning. It required him to operate with a vigilance that consumed him. Every plan he had ever executed for safety, every contingency he had ever prepared, now seemed insufficient. He could not afford a misstep, not now, not when Leah's life, her very essence, was at stake. The threat forced Raymond to examine his vulnerabilities, to confront the limitations of his influence. For the first time in years, he understood that not all dangers could be neutralized through intimidation, wealth, or strategy. Some threats were intangible, born from circumstances and intentions beyond his control. And yet, even as he recognized the gravity of the situation, he refused to let it dictate her life entirely. He would intercept, intervene and protect, but he would not cage her. She would remain free and she would remain alive. That balance was delicate, precarious, and the slightest miscalculation could unravel everything he had worked for. Leah, unaware of the full scope of danger encroaching on her life, continued her routines with grace and determination. Her independence was a shield and a lure, a testament to her strength and a magnet for risk. The threat moved in the shadows, adjusting, probing, waiting for an opening. And Raymond, aware of its presence in a way she could never perceive, intensified his watch. Every movement he made, every silent decision, was calibrated to ensure that no harm would touch her. The tension in his chest, a mixture of fear and control, was both a curse and a driving force. By the end of this stage, Raymond understood the stakes as he had never understood them before. The threat was not abstract, not distant, not a matter of speculation. It was immediate, personal, and aimed directly at Leah. And though he had always believed he could control outcomes, protect lives, and neutralize danger, this threat defied every principle he had ever followed. It demanded focus, sacrifice, and vigilance at levels he had not anticipated. And most importantly, it reminded him, in a way that was as terrifying as it was inevitable, that some dangers could not be ignored, no matter how carefully one tried to calculate the world around them. The city's night air had a weight to it, thick with expectation, and yet Leah moved through it with an unshakable calm that belied the tension around her. Raymond followed, close but careful to remain unseen, the shadows giving him both cover and perspective. Every step she took, every glance she threw into the quiet streets, was a reminder of how far she had grown, strong, independent, and yet unknowingly stepping deeper into the web he had built around her for her safety. He had been aware of the external threat for days now, every instinct screaming at him that danger could strike at any moment. But there was another force he could no longer ignore, himself. The jealousy that had simmered quietly in the background now burned hotter, sharpened by the sight of her moving freely, laughing lightly at something only she understood. He could not control her, not completely, and yet the idea of her slipping even slightly from his influence was unbearable. It was the tension of a predator forced to hold back from its own instinct, and he felt it in every muscle, every breath, every heartbeat. Leah stopped suddenly at the corner of a narrow alley, her attention caught by a flicker of movement in the distance. Raymond's muscles tensed. He was only a shadow away, but in that moment, all he could focus on was the small, delicate curve of her shoulder, the tilt of her head as she scanned the quiet street. She looked so unaware, so unprotected, and yet so captivating in her strength. The pull he felt toward her was magnetic, immediate, overwhelming, the kind of pull that ignored reason and logic, that defied the carefully maintained rules he had lived by for years. He approached her slowly, silently, until he was just behind her, the wall beside her pressing lightly against her back. His breath hitched subtly at the closeness, the electric tension between them undeniable. The night around them seemed to shrink, the city fading into shadows and silence, leaving only the two of them suspended in a moment that was fragile and dangerous. Raymond had never let himself feel this way, never allowed the pull of a woman to override his instincts of control and vigilance. Yet here he was, teetering on the edge of impulse and restraint, the invisible line he had always maintained threatening to dissolve entirely. Leah leaned casually against the wall, unaware of the intensity simmering just inches away. Her independence, the very thing that had drawn his attention and awakened jealousy before, now made her more magnetic, more untouchable, and yet more dangerous. Raymond's mind raced, calculating risks he had never considered. The closeness, the proximity, the subtle heat of her body just beside him, the possibility of losing control in a way he could not undo. He had always been the observer, the guardian, the unseen hand shaping her life, but this moment challenged everything he had ever known about restraint. Time stretched, each second laden with unspoken tension. The night seemed to pulse with possibility, and Raymond felt it in the pit of his stomach. The sharp awareness that one wrong movement, one miscalculated gesture, could shatter the delicate balance they had maintained for months. And yet, the pull was irresistible. He wanted to close the distance, to claim the proximity that both thrilled and terrified him. To protect her, yes, but also to feel her presence, to let the tension between them speak the words neither dared to voice. Leah shifted slightly, and the small movement sent a jolt through him. Raymond had spent so long trying to predict and control her path that he had forgotten the simple human truth. Some forces cannot be managed, cannot be tamed. She was alive, vibrant, uncontainable, and standing just beyond the line he had always promised himself he would never cross. And in that moment the pull was undeniable, a storm beneath the calm veneer of the city night. He wanted to close the distance, to bridge the invisible line, but the threat outside and the line inside kept him anchored, torn between desire and duty, between control and surrender. The wall behind her was cool, steady, and silent, holding her upright while Raymond's mind and body fought against instinct and restraint. Every second was a negotiation. Every breath, every heartbeat, every subtle shift in posture measured against a vow he could not break, yet a desire he could no longer suppress. The night stretched on, silent but electric, until Raymond finally stepped back into the shadows, the tension unresolved but undeniable. He would protect her, always, but he would not ignore the storm that had begun between them, a force more dangerous, more compelling than any threat lurking in the streets. Jealousy had never been a part of Raymond's life. It was a foreign, unwelcome sensation, one he had long prided himself on being immune to. His decisions, his power, his influence, they were built on logic, control, and an absence of vulnerability. But Leah had changed that. She had entered his world with a quiet strength, an independence that defied the patterns he had always relied upon, and had awakened a fire in him that he neither understood nor welcomed. What he had once dismissed as subtle possessiveness now revealed itself as the raw, unfiltered truth. His jealousy was rooted not in desire alone, but in the depth of care he had never allowed himself to acknowledge. The realization hit him slowly, painfully, with the weight of years of denial pressing down on his chest. He had spent so long believing that his role was purely protective, that his bond with Leah was one-sided, measured, controllable. And yet, the closer he had watched her navigate the world, the more he had seen her thrive independently, the more he recognized an unfamiliar, undeniable truth. His emotions had grown beyond duty. They were personal. They were raw. And they were consuming. The truth of his jealousy was not simple. It was layered, complicated, and terrifying in its intensity. He was jealous not just of the attention she might give to another, but of every moment in which she moved freely without his guidance, every step she took into a world he could not control, every breath she drew that reminded him of his inability to shield her completely. It was a jealousy born of love disguised as protection, of desire hidden under a mask of vigilance, of fear dressed in the clothes of possession. Raymond had never been forced to confront such a feeling before, and the revelation left him exposed, vulnerable in ways he had long thought impossible. This truth unfolded quietly, in the spaces between his observations of her. He noticed the way her laughter lingered when she spoke to someone else, the way her eyes lit up at the smallest joys, the way she moved without awareness of the careful calculations surrounding her life. Each detail, seemingly insignificant to anyone else, struck him with the weight of inevitability. His mind, trained to analyze, protect, and predict, could not shield him from the realization that his jealousy was not fleeting, not superficial, but intrinsic to the bond he had with her, a bond that had grown deeper than he had ever allowed himself to admit. Leah remained unaware of the storm inside him. She continued to navigate her life with a confident grace, her independence a testament to her resilience and strength. Yet every decision she made, every smile she offered, every glance she gave another person, fed the quiet intensity of Raymond's emotions. The truth behind his jealousy was not mere reaction. It was a reflection of the depth of feeling he had buried beneath decades of control and detachment. It revealed a vulnerability that he could neither control nor deny. For Raymond, this truth was a revelation and a burden. It forced him to confront the limits of his own restraint, to measure the depth of his emotions against the reality of her independence. He had always believed he could manage outcomes, predict dangers, and orchestrate lives, but this was different. Leah's presence had undone the careful structures he had relied on. The jealousy he now understood was a mirror of his own humanity, a force that both threatened and defined him. It was no longer merely a challenge to his control, it was a revelation of what he truly felt, an undeniable claim on a part of his heart he had never recognized as vulnerable before. By the end of this stage, Raymond understood something crucial. His jealousy was the truth he had refused to see, the mirror reflecting the depth of his bond with Leah. It was not weakness. It was not a flaw. It was a signal of the profound, unacknowledged connection that had always existed between them, a connection that shaped his choices, his vigilance, and his unspoken devotion. And in acknowledging it, he realized that his actions, his protection, and his restraint were no longer just about safety. They were about preserving the delicate balance between the woman he had sworn to protect and the man who had finally recognized the truth of his own heart. The city had shifted, almost imperceptibly, under the weight of what had transpired between them. Months of tension, restraint, and unspoken longing had woven a fragile web, taut with desire and fear, around Raymond and Leah. Each had felt the pull, recognized it, yet neither had dared acknowledge it openly. But the moment had come when words were unnecessary, when the air between them pulsed with the gravity of mutual understanding. The unspoken truths that had defined their connection since the beginning now demanded recognition. Leah moved with the same careful confidence she always had, yet beneath it lay an awareness she could no longer ignore. She sensed the intensity of his presence, the invisible force that had always guided her steps, protected her choices, and shaped her world without her knowledge. That force had grown over time, no longer just vigilance or duty, but something deeper, undeniable, and personal. Raymond's eyes, once cool and distant, now held an unshakable clarity, a quiet ferocity that mirrored what she had secretly felt herself. A bond that neither could deny, a claim neither had spoken but both understood. Raymond, for his part, felt the culmination of everything he had held back for months, years even. The jealousy, the protectiveness, the fierce need to keep her safe, all of it had led to this moment. The restraint that had defined him, that had prevented him from acting on the undeniable pull between them, finally gave way to acknowledgement. It was not impulsive, reckless, or uncontrolled. It was precise, deliberate, and inevitable. A recognition of the connection that had always existed, hidden beneath layers of duty, fear, and longing. The wall that had once symbolized distance, boundaries, and restraint now became the backdrop for understanding. Leah leaned against it, the night air cooling the tension that had burned between them, yet it could not quench the heat that had built over countless stolen glances, silent interventions, and moments of mutual awareness. Raymond stepped closer, bridging the gap that had always existed between their worlds. Every movement was deliberate, every breath calculated to convey what words could not, the acknowledgement of shared feelings, the acceptance of the bond that had always tied them together. There was no need for confessions. No clumsy words could capture the depth of what both had experienced in silence. The months of tension, of observing and protecting, of restraining desire in the name of duty, had crystallized into a single, undeniable truth. They belonged to one another, not in possession, not in control, but in recognition of the bond that had grown quietly, invisibly, over time. Each knew the other's heart through actions, glances, and careful proximity. Now the acknowledgement was mutual, complete, and irrevocable. The external threats, the jealousy, the careful orchestration of protection, all of it receded into the background. What remained was the raw, undeniable force of connection. Raymond's vigilance, once defined by duty, now intertwined seamlessly with his desire. Leah's independence, once a source of subtle tension, now harmonized with the unspoken understanding between them. They were no longer separated by walls, by unspoken fears, or by the invisible line he had long maintained. The claim they made on each other was not about ownership, it was about recognition, a mutual acceptance of the feelings they had both always harbored but had never dared to name. Time seemed to pause, compressing the tension and anticipation into a single electric moment. Every heartbeat, every breath, every subtle shift in the space between them was infused with the acknowledgement of what had always been true. Raymond's careful control, Leah's quiet independence, the months of silent observation, and the undeniable pull of jealousy had all converged into clarity. They could no longer deny the bond, could no longer separate feeling from duty. It was no longer a question of whether the emotions existed. It was a matter of embracing them, claiming them, and allowing them to define the present and the future. By the end of this act, both understood the full truth of their connection. What had been restrained by duty, complicated by jealousy, and tested by external threats now existed freely, fully, and irreversibly. Raymond and Leah, once separated by distance, restraint, and circumstance, now recognized what had always been theirs. The claim was not about control, possession, or dominance. It was about acknowledgement, acceptance, and the quiet power of a bond forged in adversity, tempered by desire, and solidified in the silent recognition of shared feelings. For the first time, they moved forward not as protector and protected, but as equals, bound by what they had always felt but had never dared to claim.